open and collaborative discussion around confidential computing. And so we try to make every member, every attendee, and every project feel welcome and be open and transparent. So feel free to speak up, even if this is your first time. We would love to hear from you. This meeting is, however, covered by the Linux Foundation's antitrust policy. If you are not familiar with it, if you're new, then linuxfoundation.org/antitrust-policy. I'd encourage everybody to be familiar with this through CCC meetings. So let's go talk about the agenda for just a second. I mentioned that I do want to, even if I have to call time, we do want to end in 90 minutes. I did see a request from Michael to move the voting stuff within the first half hour, because I think, Michael, you said you have to leave after 30 minutes and you wanted to be there for the vote. Okay.
Unfortunately, sorry.
Gotcha. So I put bullets 2 and 3 being the only ones that I think would affect any votes up at the beginning to accommodate Michael. Other than that, is there anything else to modify on the agenda here before we move into it?
I have a question to do with voting. I don't mind when we do that, but just a question.
Let's do it when we get into the approval of minutes.
That's fine.
Okay. All right. Unless it affects this slide here. Okay, so let's make sure we have quorum. Stefano, can you help me just verify, do we have quorum, yes or no? I think we do, but.
Yes, we do.
Okay, then I'm not going to spend time on that, just to keep us moving along in the slightly shorter time. Oh, I can see somebody learned how to draw on the screen. Great. All right. Approval of minutes. Out of those, okay, so the approval of minutes is done just by the voting reps here. So if your name is on that list. For the minutes from February 11th, I saw, Stefano, you did make the one correction or the one typo edit that I pointed out, but otherwise it looked good to me. Is there anybody else out of the voters that need more time to review the minutes? If not, then go ahead.
This is Dan. I haven't had a chance to review them yet. Simon switched out with me here, so I didn't.
Okay. Are you okay with us going to a vote and you abstaining, or would you like us to delay the vote?
So long as there's no voting, I don't think there was any voting material in the last meeting, so I don't think there's anything I need to be worried about, so I can abstain.
Okay. All right, so you abstain. Okay. Is there any of the other voting members that would that have other amendments necessary before approval, or would need to abstain? Going once, going twice. Okay, so we will consider the minutes approved. Dan, you're still welcome to review, and if you do spot anything, send it to Stefano and me to have edited. But otherwise, we will assume that they're good. All right, because we can always correct them later, so that's why we don't do the roll call vote on the approval of the minutes, where for things that are very difficult to reverse or to amend, then we would do a roll call vote. So, all right. Mike, since that was a vote, did you have any question on voting at this point?
Well, it's really to do with the makeup of the voting members, because it's different to how it works for the governing board. And there were initial plans to think about changing it in a sort of project-led way, but we've never done that. And I was wondering whether we might want to consider for the TAC doing something similar to what they do with the GB, so that the general members have some sort of way to express their opinion. It's not huge because of the things we're voting on, but I just wanted to raise it, really.
Okay. I guess I'd prefer to keep the time on the things in the agenda, because that could be a short or it could be a long discussion.
Yeah, no, I don't suggest we discuss it now, but I wanted to raise it as a thing to see whether people are interested in discussing it, so that when the minutes the next one come out, we can decide whether we care, if that makes sense.
There is a longer discussion of what is in and has been in the project progression policy about graduation stage projects and so on. That is very closely related to what you're talking about.
Indeed.
For those of you that are new, our charter says that graduation stage projects, of which we have 0, have votes on the TAC. But no projects before that stage do. That's basically what it says right now, but we've never ratified that statement, right? We've only ratified any stuff in the project progression policy.
And given where projects are, I was wondering whether we wanted to consider an alternative. That was sort of the question, really.
if you'd like to make a proposal for us to discuss, feel free, but I don't know if anybody else wants to speak up.
Well, I would encourage the general members to
I
consider.
mean, I'd like to have a vote.
That was Jethro,
Yeah.
right?
Really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really, I think there's two parts of your question. One is about projects and one is about general members, right? Where general members have an elected representative on the governing board, but under the TAC, right?
Yeah.
And so I think your question about general members is, should the Constitution be that there's also an elected member out of the general members to have a vote on the TAC? I think
there's actually
that
going to be
fair.
there's going to be 2 general members shortly. We just had enough general members join such that we're going to elect a second representative.
And that's what made me think of it.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
So
Yeah, it might be a good
this feels
discussion to
very
put on-
charter-like. So how about I take an action to
Sounds
the
good.
board?
Yep.
To have this discussion on the board.
Yeah, since this is really a TAC charter question and it is tied to that, I think that would be great. We're happy to.
Thank you. I'm sorry to
Yeah.
Nope, it's an excellent point to raise, and the fact that you raised it here, Mike, means that I have heard at least one general member say, well, they think that's a good idea. So
Yep.
I'm happy to start to shape this to the board.
Yeah.
Such that we carry the kind of consistent voting through.
Gotcha.
Happy to do so.
Yep. Yeah. So that is it. I mean, that is something that's immediately of effect. And so let's talk about that at the board meeting. And of course, board meetings are open to anybody, but Mike and I basically have to be at the board meeting, but anybody else is welcome to be at the board meeting. So, and unless Stephen tells me otherwise, it's an open, all our meetings are open. So, all right. Are we ready to move on? Any other comments on Mike's question? Sounds like Stephen, you have the action item.
I have an action to take this to the board. Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Mike. So let us go ahead and get into the AAA SIG proposal. So I think, Dimitri, you want to lead the discussion of this? Do you want to share?
Before we go over the document, I had some questions about how this is being run. Like I see emails from time to time that there are no agenda topics and the meeting is canceled, but this implies that there is some kind of meeting series. Where has this been announced?
I think you might be confusing. I've not seen any such emails except for from the Open Enclaves attestation SIG. So unrelated to CC, well, not unrelated, but the CCC proposed SIG has a mailing list. There is Open Enclave that also has underneath their project, there's a project specific SIG that does have a mailing list and does have periodic meetings, and those ones do get canceled when there's nothing on the agenda. But that's separate from this SIG. That one is very Open Enclave specific.
Oh, I see. Is that, wait, so are you saying that the CCC AAA SIG has a mailing list or doesn't have one?
It does have a mailing list, and it could be that the meeting series for Open Enclave has been announced on the cross project. So there's a cross project mailing list, right? So that's the attestation at Confidential Computing, if I remember the name right. I'm sure Stefano will correct me if that's wrong. Separately, there's the Open Enclave one, but the point of the attestation at mailing list in CCC is to share cross-project information. So,
Sure, okay.
It's likely that OE is sharing their own notes about when they talk about attestation, just for the benefit of any other projects who want to collaborate and maybe come to an OE meeting. And any other project is welcome to do the same.
Okay, so but the attestation at lists, that's the cross project mailing list, right?
Correct.
But nonetheless, Open Enclave is advertising their attestation SIG on that cross project mailing list.
You got it.
Okay, now I understand what's going on.
Don't
Okay, and
confuse it
so
as
what's
a
the mailing
different
list
SIG.
for the AAA SIG?
That is an open discussion. Right now, one proposal is to reuse that same list.
Yeah, okay.
Now-
Just to add to the confusion.
Well, I guess that's up to when we get into this document, what does it say? And if you have feedback on that, we can discuss it. But I would be fine reusing that same list. Maybe we need the cross-project attestation list, but
Okay. And then I've heard some rumors about a AAA SIG Slack channel. Does anyone know anything about this?
I think, yeah, go ahead.
There is a CCC Slack that we've been experimenting with, and part of this proposal would be to create a dedicated channel for the SIG to do work in. But that I don't think that exists yet.
I think that's right. So Dimitri, do you want me to share or would you like to share? Dimitri, do you have audio? I know you're on the call.
And maybe while Dimitri's getting his audio up, if there's specific incarnations of things like mailing lists and chat services, I feel like we can probably vote without those being specific because we might change chat platforms.
Right. There are two things. There are two questions that would be separate votes, which we could do either or both, or in theory, neither of them, although I would kind of like to get to at least one vote. One vote is, should we create this, the proposed SIG with the proposed charter? And so that's why we want to talk about the charter and so on. And then separately would be, what should be the makeup of the chair, parenthesis S, which would be a separate vote from the creation of the SIG itself. And so I'm hoping we can get to the first vote if we're ready to do that. Last time when we chatted about it, I had asked whether we want to tie the code's technical charter into this SIG vote. In other words, do we want to consider that to be the part of the same vote, or the creation of a repo with the technical charter to be a separate one? And that was contingent on having a technical charter, which I have not seen. And so I don't know if Dimitri or somebody has the technical charter ready for us to review. And so that was the TBD on my slide there. All right, is there one of the authors that would like to speak to this? I've not heard Dimitri yet.
Yeah, it seems like Dimitri must be having trouble with his audio. This is Keith. We have not had a chance to get to the technical charter yet. So I can't confirm that. So
given that, out of the proponents of this, between Keith, Dimitri, Ava, etc., I know there's a number of you involved, would you want to delay the vote so that you can bundle it with the technical charter, or would you be okay having two votes, one to create the SIG without the technical charter and do that as a separate vote at, over email at the next meeting?
I think it might be better to go ahead and delay the vote and let us have the two bundled together. And there's still a couple comments here in the doc to resolve as well.
Okay, so let's just take some time here and go through the comments here. And it sounds like we will, unless somebody else makes a motion, then we will not actually have a vote on this. And I'm just letting you know, Michael, so that if we go past 7:30, that you're not going to miss the vote.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Thanks for that.
Okay. All right, so Keith, do you want to walk us through this until Dimitri gets audio? The changes or open questions? Or do you want to share, or are you okay with me just sharing it all?
I'm all right with you doing so.
Okay.
So I do have a comment on there that we do need to attach the technical charter.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Is there anything else you want me to just tell me where to go to? So.
Some comments added yesterday that I haven't had a chance to go through that may be worth visiting. So the ones from Eric, I think.
Oh, that's right. You know what? I didn't do calls. I did not do intros right after I went to that slide here. So if this is your first meeting or you haven't introduced yourself at the beginning of a meeting, would you like to do so now? So I think I want Eric. I would like you to introduce yourself. You may have been here before. I don't remember, but I'd like Eric to introduce yourself first, and then I'll look to see if there's others.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi there, I'm Eric Voigt from Cisco, and I have worked attestation for a bit over in the IETF and at the network level. I got interested in this, joining the CCC, mostly because of this particular SIG, because I think that there's a lot of opportunity for attesting peers. So this is certainly of interest to me. And I guess that's it for now.
Excellent. Thanks for being here, Eric. And let's see, Tom, were you here before, or is this your first meeting to introduce yourself?
No, I haven't introduced myself before. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, obviously. Tom Roeder, I work at Google on virtualization security. I obviously, you saw on the agenda, I have a proposal, and we'll talk about that soon.
Great. Thanks for being here. Is there anybody else that I missed that's here for the first time or that hasn't been here for the intros part at the beginning of the meeting?
So this is Sean Wei-Sun from Intel. So
yeah.
I'm first time here. So I have been working on the OE attestation for quite a while, and So this is interesting to me.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, so some of your names, since I'm in other meetings with you, I can never remember if you've introduced yourself in this meeting. So good to see Eric and Shadway and folks here. Is there anybody else that I've missed that's here for the first time?
Well, Dave, can I suggest, if you're getting confusion, you should drop all other meetings. This is clearly the most important one. So.
Yeah, but then I couldn't give my discussions like report on the IETF attestation. So that would, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So there's problems, you know. All right. All right. So let's go back into here and let's talk about maybe Eric's comment here. Eric or Keith?
Yeah, I can talk to it. Basically, one of the things I think would be interesting here is to understand not just that you're attesting, but what you're attesting as well. And I don't know if that's too detailed for this, but understanding why the attestation is believable wasn't actually explicitly said, and I don't know if that's something that we want to highlight.
Eric, you mean explicitly enumerate the claims that we're attesting to and explain or document why we're including them?
Yes, for example, at least I know some places it talks about TPMs, but you can assert, claims, but you don't necessarily talk about the environment that claims are being asserted from, so you can't really evaluate them in total. It's a little different for secure enclaves. Some places might think I have to know my, chain of trust for boot to even know if this is running in a place I want to. So I'm really just talking about the environment under which the claims might be asserted.
I think that's a good point. And I also want to highlight that part of my goal in working with folks to propose this SIG is to make a space for all of those discussions to happen that does not block on the TAC meeting.
Yep. Okay.
Okay, and I think that, by environment that the claims are made in, you mean the root of trust, like the CPU manufacturer, for instance, or do you mean the environment, like the platform security? Because we talked about that some in the last meeting as well.
Yeah, I think it will vary based on who's actually attesting. In some cases, it might not be necessary to assert it. In some cases, it will.
Is that a claim unto itself?
I think it is.
So what I'm hearing so far is that it would be good to either update the language or add a bullet, whichever, to say that discussion of actual claims, the environments making the claims, would be in scope as a topic. Right.
Okay, that sounds good. We'll update. We'll
Okay.
We'll make sure that this is included as a.
Okay. So I'm going to keep moving here, Eric.
Yes, next thing is they're talking in the thing, you're talking formats like X509, Cozy, OpenSSL, great stuff. The question of if you're going to interwork, do you have to know that it's going over EAP? Do you have to know it's going over TLS? And so the questions of full integratability might require some lower level protocols if we're doing full stack integration. And I'm just trying to see if those are also in scope here.
Yeah, I definitely think that the transport security is in scope for the SIG document. It's going to be a big part of it, in fact. So that's a good point that the wording should be changed there.
Yep. And we can get the specifics. I just wanted to make sure it was in scope.
Yep.
Thanks. And I think that's really the only new comments since.
Okay. Yep. That's one from the previous meeting. That one's is Ned. Are you on the call? I don't think so. So I just have, does it pertain to CCC endpoints? Answer is yes. Since this was after last meeting here, I'm just going to call up this one. So since one of those other meetings that I go to is the IETF TEAT meetings, and so yes to Ned's question. Ned's question is, I see you referencing rats here, although it's only in a such as, right? So it's only by way of example, it's not by way of limitation. And so TEAP also has specifications that relate to CCC endpoints. I don't know whether it's necessary to call that out because this is just a such as. I don't know what others think.
I will just call it out for clarity.
Okay.
More clarity is better than less clarity. Yeah, if there is a question, I'll make sure that this is called out. But
Okay.
Yeah, and I think we talked about that comment in the last meeting, and that was the conclusion there too. We must not have captured it in the comment.
Yeah.
Okay. So our last meeting was the 11th, and this was only entered on the 21st, and so they might have added a comment. So.
Yeah, it was last month, the comment.
So
Oh, it is. You're right. Sorry, I missed that. Okay. All right.
As far as governance, there was a couple of comments, especially around voting to not require super majority. Those have all been updated.
Okay.
And Dimitri, I can talk to my to my status, which is I believe I am fine to take part.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you for giving me the time to check that. Appreciate it.
You can just delete the to verify and we'll be good there.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So it sounds like, Keith, there's additional edits that you want to make here before the vote. Are there things you wanted us to discuss in the call today?
Actually, the last time we discussed was leaving that in there for the vote, but deleting it prior to publish.
Yep. My suggestion here is, given the tax governance document structure, it's tracked in GitHub. When this gets turned into an actual technical charter, it specified the structure of the governance of the SIG. And once the repo is created, then in that repo, the initial members are written down.
So as I'm creating the proposed charter, I'm not actually creating the repo, am I? We're going to vote on the creation of the SIG, and this will trigger creation of the repository. We'll publish this document in the repository, and then we'll remove the names.
Yes, and we'll create a separate file next to that charter with additional details, such as who is on who the chairs are, what their terms are, things like that, so that over time those files can be updated separately as chairs rotate, without having to go back to the TAC to ask for the actual charter itself to change.
Understood. Okay, thanks.
And a vote of approval, Ava, you'd mentioned that is what triggers the creation of the repository. And just to be clear, is the repository one that would be created under the existing confidential computing GitHub organization? Or do we think that this would require a different GitHub organization than the one that exists right now?
The difference there is, if we create a single repository under the existing GitHub organization, then this work is limited to a single repo, which comes with limitations on testing and management. If we create a separate org, it might be CCC AAA, picking a random name, then that the SIG can then spin up multiple repos with different owners to track different proofs of concept and different work streams. I think that's more scalable over time, but I can't say for sure we need it right now, but I'd rather future-proof this.
So one of the updates we did discuss last meeting was that this document was updated to change from saying repo to saying org.
Yeah. So if I haven't made that update somehow, yes, that's my understanding as well. We should create an org, and there was, by the way, a slight confusion in the AAA name. So I don't remember who. I apologize. Somebody suggested just calling this A4 or something like this, or A3, and I've updated the name as well to avoid confusion with other AAA things in the industry.
Yeah, and that is 0.6 under minimum viable governance. If people want to make sure that is.
Yes.
Yep, there it is. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
Verify the wording on that. Yeah.
Organization. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't mention which GitHub or what the actual label would be in here, but
we should put a name in the charter so that that's clearly agreed upon.
Okay.
Not something that we randomly pick.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be done right now if we're going to delay the vote, but I think it should be in here so that we're voting on a consistent thing. So add.
So to be clear, should that be in the proposal here or in the charter or both?
It's okay in both.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it has to be in the technical charter. I think it's okay in here.
Yeah, I agree. I think for governance reasons, it has to be in the technical charter because that's effectively what we hand to LF when they go make the organization.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
So
Thank you.
did you have a specific preference you want any feedback on right now, or are you okay just doing that in a later step with the literal name of the GitHub org? I think I heard verbally an example or something out here, but I don't know if that's an actual proposal.
So a quick counter proposal for 1 minute of discussion.
Mm-hmm.
If the charter specifies that it uses the existing confidential computing GitHub org, but that we could create multiple repos under the auspices of this charter,
mm-hmm.
then if the SIG chairs decide down the road to bless a new repo, they can just go to Stefano and say, hey, spin up a new one, without having to go through the process on GitHub itself of making a new org. Do folks have any objection to that, as it might be a little simpler to implement?
I like having a separate org. I don't feel obligated to name that org right now. I think that often when we have to name things in group settings like this, that ends up consuming a lot of time. It feels like so long as we're saying, these are the resources that we're approving, the name of those resources can be figured out in execution.
Cool. I'm fine with that, and agreed. Naming something in a meeting like this is hard.
Okay. So let's not try to do naming on this call here, especially since we're not voting on it, but it does have to be in the technical charter by the time that we approve that. Not that we want to debate it at the time that we're reviewing that. We just needs to be filled in there before we can vote on the technical charter.
And if people do have proposals or thoughts on that, feel free to add them to that comment there, and we'll, when we create the charter, try and come up with a reasonable one for the vote.
Okay. Okay, so what else, Keith or Dimitri?
Anything else, Dimitri?
That's recently changed? Do you want to highlight in the text?
No, I think that's all. I think that was the only. The voting was switched to simple majority. That was the main set of changes I made before before last meeting, actually, which I wasn't able to attend. Okay, so I think that's very clear. Thanks. I will take care. Keith and I will take care of creating of the technical charter before, and we'll resolve all of the comments before the next meeting. So our goal is to have a technical charter written up, and prepare this for the vote. A point of educate me, please. Do I go and create a technical charter in the Linux Foundation?
Yeah. So what you should do is there's the technical charter template, which is on the groups.io in the main files TAC here. So in project submissions here. So under project submissions, right here is the technical charter template. Okay. And so you create a document based off this template and you drop it in the submitted folder here.
Okay. It was the dropping it in the submitted part that I think we were.
Okay, so right in here, you can see there's nothing ready for vote, right? And the other folders here are things that these are the things that we previously approved that we've moved from the other folder into this one at the time that we vote at the TAC level. Okay.
And you won't have permission to actually put it in that folder, but you can send it to Dave or to myself and we can.
Good point. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Keith and Dimitri and folks. Unless there's anything else on this one, so your next tasks are to do those edits, create the technical charter, send it to us, and once we see both of those, then we can put it up for a vote. The assumption is that we want to have one vote on the collection of the technical charter plus the charter. Sure, actually two different things, names aside, and then a separate vote to talk about the actual chair proposals, or the chair names. So it sounds like the proposal is to do that at next meeting. And if that's right, then we want the two documents to be sent out at least, say, 2 days in advance of the next meeting, if not before.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Understood. Yep.
Okay. Anyone else on that one, or shall we move on? All right. Let's go ahead and move on. All right. So action item review. All right. So Mike, anything that any status?
No.
Okay. All right, Stephen, I believe your next item is done. Would you like to say anything about the Lisa 21?
No, everybody got mail a number of weeks ago. Outreach is looking at it. I'm bringing forward the named outreach for us to support it, to be a sponsoring org.
Okay, so I'm just crossing that one off as being a completed action item.
Thank you.
All right, Stefano.
I'm still working with Craig on this one. We have updated the outreach and TAC white papers, so I'll get those posted shortly. The DOI just needs to be there needs to be an application, and I'll likely reach out to you, Dave, once the application is ready to go out, so that you can take a look at it.
Okay. All right. What about where are we at with the license scanning discussion?
So I think where we're at now is folks should have received, specifically, I think I chose the voting members of the TAC to receive the specific details as to, the costs and cost benefit sheet that they put up for us. So really it's just coming down to the TAC agreeing that the price listed and the benefits that they get being appropriate.
So I think it's fine to share the information with the full TAC list, right? It's only the vote on the budget that's the voting members, but I don't see any reason to exclude non-voting members. So
yeah, you're welcome to share it on this call. Okay. They just didn't want it sent out to a mailing list that had a broad subscribership.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Since it includes pricing information.
Gotcha. Okay. So you're saying this was at the request of LF, not based on CCC policy?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. All right. Unless there's any questions on that one, we'll keep going on the list. But if there's questions for Stefano, bring them up.
Yeah, I think we can circle back on this next call. And if you just want to share that sheet on the call next week or in 2 weeks, I think the price was within our range. We had said something, it was something to the effect of $10,000 or $15,000 a year. And I think everyone agreed on one of the calls that that was a pretty insubstantial amount of money.
Okay. So you said they didn't want it on a list, but if we project it in a meeting, the recordings are available to anybody that subscribes, right?
No, the recordings, that's true. They are available to everybody on the list. Yeah, I can pause the recording while we go over it.
I mean, normally we would have a policy that says we would want to share it, but they're saying, the external organization, in this case, LF, is saying don't do that. So.
Right. Yeah, that's fine. I can pause.
Okay, so we'll put it on the agenda for next time to bring up then once we figure out what the right way to do that is that meets LF requirements. So
sounds good.
All right. Yeah, it kind of goes against our culture, but it's not our stuff. So
legal pricing, they tend to be very paranoid.
Yeah.
Legal department.
All right. So I know Stefano and Ava, you've had discussions about the CCC announce list. Would you like to announce anything about the CCC lists?
Yeah, so Ava had a great recommendation that we spin up a page in terms of getting involved on the website. So we spun that up. We sent a message out to TAC just to let them know that there are links up to the mailing lists and to our Twitter and LinkedIn accounts. And then the outreach committee can groom some text for that page.
So that's only half of it, right? I mean, that's the stuff that's ready to announce. The original action item here is whether it is possible to subscribe to the CCC announce list without creating a CCC account.
Right. And it is not. All of the lists and access to all of the subgroups is gated on creating an LF membership account, which, as I've walked a couple of folks through this for their first time, the feedback I've gotten from, we'll call them end users, is, do I need to become a paid member of the foundation before I join the mailing list? No. But they think that from the current flow on the website. Why do I have to join the Linux Foundation? Do I have to pay for that? Again, they don't, but the way it's set up, folks, especially coming from open source or elsewhere, who are accustomed to just join a mailing list with the mailing address, email address, and that's it. The multiple gates to create accounts at different points along the way deters a lot of people from joining our announce list.
So that's why this one is not resolved yet. It's still an action item, right? To figure out how to do that.
Yes. Stefano, any updates from you on, can we make the announce list specifically not gated on an LF membership account.
Yeah, the best way to do that is just to take it off of our lists.confidentialcomputing.org and move it into a different area. The systems that the LF has set up are specifically tracking things like who's signing up and who's going to what meetings in hopes of providing useful data back to the members. So yeah, it's perfectly okay to take a list off of that system, and that way it'll be really easy for folks to sign up.
So I have a process question for tracking this. Is this action item something that needs to continue to be on the TAC list of action items? Or is this an action item that would be appropriate to move to the outreach action item list?
Yeah, I can take the action item to move that over.
Okay, because then it will come up in the outreach meetings, which are weekly rather than in this meeting.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Okay, great.
Sounds good. And I'll just speak to the last action item. I will indeed get back to everyone once the chat integration, which is called Matrix, is complete.
Okay.
And for now, we do have a Slack set up that's just our temporary home so that we can chat if we need to.
Okay. Any other action items that I missed? I think that's everything that was in the minutes from last time, returning or new. Just a placeholder. Is there anything that the outreach committee needs to report that would be of importance to the TAC? This would be an example of anything to say about the graphene webinar right after this meeting or other topics?
It's Steve. The one thing that is probably a good heads up for this group is we've got a couple of events. Well, OC3 is an event that's coming up. We may have a virtual booth at it in a few weeks' time. If we do, everybody here will be welcomed and encouraged to put up their hand to spend some time in the booth. Similar kind of discussion as we get closer to the Usenix Lisa event if we sponsor there.
And I would remind people that OC3 is organized by one of our members, Edgeless Systems. And I think a number of the projects or members are also speaking there. So
that is good data.
It is worthy of support.
Absolutely.
Question for the graphene event, do we have links to it?
Yeah, there was a link that was sent out. Let's see, Stephen or Stefano, can you dig up the link and just paste it into the chat to make it easier to find for anybody who wants to drop over to the graphene webinar after this?
I'm going to trust Stefano to do that because I'm worried that I'd post the wrong link. Thank you, Stefano.
Okay, yep. Okay. Anything else on updates from outreach? Things that the TAC needs to know? News you can use? Okay. Then with that, I think our next topic is Tom. Tom, would you like to share anything, or would you like me to just bring up issue 71?
You can go ahead and bring up the issue.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay, so just some background here. So if you remember, folks, that we had this discussion about the proposal to coordinate on like the GDB debuggers for SGX, and that was a cross-project discussion between, say, NARCS and Intel and Open Enclave. And so we were going to track that as something, and we said, hey, that's something that the mentors should coordinate on. Yeah, the TAC says this would be a good idea. If you remember all that issue, this one is kind of in that same category as that discussion. So when Tom came to me to says, what do I think we should do? I said, hey, well, we did something, we had a very similar discussion on this other topic. So sure, feel free to bring it to the TAC. It's kind of in the same category as should projects work together to accomplish a thing? And Tom's going to talk about that. So as to what the proposal is here. So not that one. This one. Yeah, here we go. And let's see, there we go. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't think it's comes as a surprise to anyone in this meeting that there is a specialized threat model that confidential computing brings up. And in this, we're calling it the host to guest model, which I think is a relatively common name. So we've been looking at some of these potential host to guest attacks and talked to some of the people upstream in the Linux kernel community, and they were not convinced that this was a threat model that their particular device tree wanted to protect against. And they said, where's the discussion in the broader Linux community about this threat model so that we can have agreement about A, what it is, and B, how we mitigate it. And while people at Google or people at Microsoft or people anywhere could have this discussion individually with the Linux kernel community or with subtrees, it makes sense to me that the group that really wants this threat model to be accepted might want to take a role in discussing that at a higher level with the Linux community at a broader level. And so my proposal is that CCC, the TAC, whoever it is in the CCC that would do that, take the lead here and coordinate with talk to people in the Linux kernel community, have this broader discussion. So I don't know what the mechanisms are because I don't really know your mechanisms. And it sounds like this is not without precedent, but yeah.
Well, it's with only a single related precedent, and that's what I was explaining. The precedent there was, since that one was between a couple of projects to communicate between themselves and maybe the relationship to GDB, and that was delegated to those projects to say, hey, you know, the mentors can just assume that there's different communication. That's the only real precedent that we have right now, and so this is kind of new ground, right? And so it could be that setting a new precedent is perfectly fine. So that's an interesting process discussion, which shouldn't assume that we actually have a process for this. So really the question is, really, do people think that this is a good idea for the CCC to support in some way, to support, you know, this on the technical basis, this discussion? And if so, how should we go about doing that?
Okay, so from my point of view, from Eric's point of view, the answer is an unequivocal yes. Absolutely. We think it's very important.
Says the person from Red Hat, yes.
And from Red Hat more generally as well. And the answer of how we do that, I think that's really interesting. I'm not hugely involved with the kernel community. I've watched from the sidelines on lots of occasions. And I guess part of the question is it worth our trying to come to a general consensus and then present that consensus, or is it worth our sort of coming to a consensus ourselves and then individually weighing in on the kernel lists in the right places to promote a discussion of that? And I don't have a view on that. I don't know this part of the kernel community at all, and I don't know it more generally, honestly. Well,
a third option here, excuse me, is inviting some members from that part of the kernel community to come into a space and chat with folks in this space who are also, you know, domain experts on this from our member companies to talk about the problem. If some of the kernel maintainers don't see the problem the same way we do, then it's, you know, that discussion does need to happen. It can happen in a sort of real-time discussion forum before it reaches the kernel mailing list. I think that would be better. I don't know how long-term this would need to be like. I don't think this is a whole SIG, but
sorry.
Yeah, like I don't think this work would need to follow the SIG model we're doing for attestation, but I do think it's worth having a place in the CCC for that, for the sort of a synchronization point between members of the CCC who want to work together on this.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think there does need to be a balance between the kernel community's preference for lots of discussion to be on lists so that you can follow the thread back, but actually at least setting out, you know, the context and the scope of it before we just throw in things. And I welcome that. I think that's probably a good approach.
And I think that's a better likelihood of success once we reach the kernel mailing list with real proposals, if we do that collectively so that the kernel maintainers see that multiple companies are bought into a similar model and agreeing to continue to support it. It's one of their criteria for accepting changes is like, it's not just one company, and the risk of code abandonment is much lower if there's multiple companies involved.
Yeah, I definitely agree that one reason I'm bringing it here is exactly that kind of multi-company support that I'm sure Linux would prefer to see. So then I guess my question is, who or how does that become a reality? What's the next steps to do that here?
Well, hang on a second, Tom. So
yeah,
I guess I'm still not quite clear on what the proposal is. In that today, if we go and enable a technology, whether it be ourselves or AMD, right? We basically create the patches and push those up, and then if the Linux kernel wants to see support, there is a mechanism for expressing that support through, tag test by, right? And that was sort of like the model that we were working through for SGX. And so I'm trying to, I'm trying to understand what space we think that this group is going to cover specifically versus, the enabling work that will probably continue, in its own stream anyway.
So one of the reasons I brought the proposal here is that there seems to be a disconnect in the kernel community between that well-established process in the kernel whereby companies send patches and people, put their name to them for having tested them, which is happening, of course, with the patches for confidential computing already on the KVM side.
Mm-hmm.
And then the implicit acceptance of that threat model that those patches imply, which so far in my, it's a very small amount of experience trying to do this, is not necessarily guaranteed. That a maintainer somewhere else in the tree can say, well, that's great that this is happening on the KVM side, but we don't see the bigger discussion about, what this means for the kernel. Why should we accept that particular threat model?
So it sounds like you have cases where you have like pull requests that are not being accepted because the basis for them isn't accepted yet, right?
Yeah,
right?
And I don't want to generalize off of one case, which is unfortunately what I'm doing in this. Maybe anywhere else in the kernel would be easier and would have gone fine. But I think it's a reasonable concern that the maintainers I talked to had, which is this is a threat model that affects the whole kernel. Because it affects, the DMA subsystem, and it affects any device that may be taking data that could be affected by the host. And it makes sense to not try to do this piecemeal, but to have some kind of broader discussion. I agree that that's not the way that I've seen the Linux kernel community function normally. Normally, it's a much more localized kind of discussion.
But I can see how this work requires changes across a pretty broad swath of kernel subsystems.
Yep.
So this is really to discuss the threat model and its implications to the kernel, not necessarily to drive specific changes to the kernel.
So this sounds
That's
almost
correct.
more like evangelism and education, where the end goal here is not land 1 or 10 patches, but educate kernel maintainers across a variety of subsystems about a new threat model that we as a group feel is important for the kernel to accept changes across each of those subsystems to support.
And to provide a context in which patches can be put. I mean, I tend to talk about isolation types And this is a third isolation type. We've got workload from workload, host from workload, and workload from host. And I call this workload from host isolation. I don't know whether using that nomenclature, the isolation rather than a threat model, is helpful or not helpful in this context. But I'm just in favor. I think we need, this is an education job.
The kernel community have asked for threat models when we've submitted patches before for new stuff like this, right? Explain to us why, right? Now, whether they believed it or not is a different matter.
Yeah, this is the kind of thing that I see in other groups like the CNCF might spin up a working group. There's no, expected code output here, and that's their differentiation between working group and SIG. But there's an expected long-term engagement with an objective and a local place in the CNCF working group model for those discussions to happen. So if we follow a similar model, we might create a good, a working group that is outside the TAC schedule, just so we don't block on these meetings, where folks can gather to talk about this, to share updates from their individual efforts to accomplish this, bring in guests from the kernel community to share their views on things, and sort of set up a place for the discussion work of sharing that knowledge to happen within the auspices of the CCC.
As I mentioned, we're kind of blazing new ground. So a couple of variations of things that we could do, assuming that there's support, which so far I'm hearing that there's a bunch of support. So if you have a dissenting opinion, please speak up. But assuming that we have support, then we could, sort of the minimum bar is we could just create a mailing list. And that's how the attestation mailing list started, was in that category. We could create a Slack channel, which is a little bit stronger in terms of collaborative. And then the next step after that is you could create, that in addition to actually scheduling some meetings, which I think Ava was just talking about now. And then the far end of the spectrum is then you could create, code and stuff to go around it and have a repository and a SIG and so on. So it's kind of the spectrum of possibilities that we have here, I think. And where do we want to fall in that spectrum of what's appropriate for the problem here?
I think we start with the minimum, which is a mailing list. See if we get enough interest. We need to make sure the right people are on that mailing list. If we get enough conversation going, we can take it from there, would be my initial response.
And my proposal would be the next step from that, create a sort of a working group, a place where more than just emails, but live discussions happen.
By live, do you mean Slack asynchronous, or do you mean synchronous in a Teams meeting, or sorry, a Zoom type meeting?
I mean a Zoom meeting plus Slack or plus mailing list, one of the two, right? A synchronous meeting on the calendar plus an asynchronous discussion medium.
In which case I support that.
I think Steve had a comment.
Thank you. Just naively, because this is well outside of my understanding space, is this something that preparing a very simple couple 3-page white paper, for lack of a better name, where you actually describe the problem and such that you can use as educational material to the kernel team, is kind of the initial goal of this discussion?
Well, I think the proposal we have in front of us kind of almost does that. And I think one of the things we should do is be discussing whether this is sufficient. I think it's necessary, but I suspect it's not sufficient yet.
Right.
Yeah, the only deliverable in the proposal sitting in the issue right now is just discussion and agreement on LKML. It sounds like, Stephen, you're asking whether it would be appropriate as part of a deliverable to have like a 3-pager in order to generate that agreement on LKML.
Well, the reason I guess I'm suggesting it, I'm not suggesting this from some, it'll be another, CCC white paper. I'm more suggesting that if it's that narrow and formal, the folks that understand can work on it. You can clarify it. It acts as a document within the TAC for all TAC members to deeply understand the problem. But then you've got a really crisp statement back to into any discussion with the kernel team that says, look, this is the problem we're talking about as we see it. and why we think this is a bigger kernel problem. So I'm not, like I said, I'm not in any way suggesting, hey, look, it's a great publication, we'll get it out there and let the world know about this. I'm saying that it becomes a really crisp way for this group to articulate the problem in such a way that somebody else can then read it and go, oh, that's what they're talking about. This is a bigger issue. Because I'm just worried that otherwise, I love listening to you folks, but you are a group of engineers. And so I think giving you a focus for writing it down might be useful.
What do you think, Tom?
So I like the idea. I think that any discussion here with the distributed nature of the Linux community has to focus on talking to and agreeing with, key members of that community. I like the idea of having a focus point being a document. I don't feel any, particular ownership about this text that this should be it. I'm fine for people to the TAC to formulate whatever they think is the right way to do this, and to come to agreement and more details as needed. So that all makes sense to me.
And Tom, I understand. Like you've written most of it here. I'm just saying, if you were in a real collectively, if any of the folks in the TAC were in a discussion with, pick half a dozen different people in the kernel community broadly, having this simple document possibly fleshed out with just a little more, I'm not knowledgeable enough to say what that would be, but just to really clarify that we as the TAC in the CCC collectively have kind of said, this is a real problem that you need to pay attention to. And here is the, kind of a clean terminology for how to think about that problem.
Yep.
And it becomes an easy thing that when you have a kernel patch, yourselves, Intel, Red Hat are all members and are all big contributors in the kernel. For any of you to be able to simply point back to this as the problem statement, as kind of an easy thing to point back to, it just feels like a way to make sure that we're all using the same words. They're all written down in one place in an easily referenceable way, rather than a long thread in different discussion groups.
Agreed.
I also think one of the important item, if I might suggest this, right? We said, hey, we need to have an agreement on the threat model and the class of attacks, which is important by itself, but also methods to mitigate them is the important outcome of that, I guess, proposal of that document should be. Because even if we agree on the threat model, but have different ways to mitigate them in different devices, we're going to confuse the users, right? We should have more or less similar ways to mitigate it. And something that I have in my mind is like a similar configuration setting that will trigger sort of different behavior in different places in the kernel, so that we don't have to do the classic thing and everybody submits their own patch and then you have to configure every single thing slightly differently. So that we can kind of agree on as common as possible method to mitigate them that will affect all of the types of drivers, or most of the drivers supported.
So I'd like to try to drive this discussion to some conclusion. So it sounds like there's a suggestion that a potential collaborative deliverable is a very short document that can be referenced by multiple pull requests and things like that, or your mails on the Linux kernel mailing list, things like that, to say, here's what we collectively believe is the threat that we're going to try to address and that everybody else should care about and accept these changes and things, and that gives a framework for other things to come in. And I'm hearing a proposal to create a we don't have to call it a working group, but a at least a mailing list and a potential Zoom series, which we've done for projects and stuff before. Whenever a project that we've approved has asked, we've done that. We've created a mailing list for attestation without a project. It sounds like the proposal on the table is to create the ability to have a Zoom series on demand, whenever there's a topic or whatever, and at least a mailing list, if not a Slack channel. Did I get that proposal right? I think Ava, it was your proposal, so. I don't know if Ava, you're still there, if you want to confirm that I summarized the proposal, because I think Mike, then you seconded the proposal, if I heard right.
Yeah.
I didn't entirely follow your summary just now, but I think that was correct.
Okay. Did you have a specific request that a Slack channel be included in the proposal, or is a mailing list plus Zoom series sufficient for the proposal? That was the part that wasn't clear to me. Or how we would do it.
Zoom plus something asynchronous, such as Slack or email, or both. I mean, I frankly don't understand why the TAC is the gate for creating a Slack channel.
I don't think we should be, yeah.
Okay, great. Then let's create a working group, the very light model that says, some people will get together and discuss this, and there will be a place for synchronous communications, a Zoom, and a place for asynchronous communications, or 2 or 3, and that group can figure it out.
Do we want to specifically try to invite driver maintainers into this discussion? Because it sounds like we need an agreement.
I'm gonna go bold here and say, let's pick a couple of folks who are keen on doing the work, and let them go decide how the work happens. Right? And if inviting kernel driver maintainers into that working group discussion is what they feel is the best way to accomplish this goal, fantastic, they should do that. If they think it's not, okay, that's up to them. My proposal is pick a few people, empower them to lead this work, and anyone else who wants to join can absolutely show up and do the work too.
So Stephen, Wally, just charter check question. Is there anything here that actually requires a vote? Or is this something that we can just say, yeah, there's certain people interested in doing it, and we create mailing lists or Zoom series at the request of members who want to participate in things?
No votes necessary as far as I can tell. It's been minuted. Go do good work.
Because I don't think this affects our budget per se. Right?
Not even a little bit.
So I don't think it requires a vote unless somebody else says that it does. But I just wanted a second opinion on that. So, okay.
Go do good work.
So do we have a list of kernel maintainers that we think that we would target for this discussion?
Tom?
What?
I haven't come up with such a list at the moment. I have some contacts internally and people who said they might have ideas, but I'm open to other ideas from outside. So no, I don't have such a list right now.
I've done a tiny bit of work at the virtualization layer with kernel folks. I have a couple of folks I would want to reach out to. I think one of the things that this working group can do is come up with that list together.
All right, so it sounds like the next step is to at least create the mailing list and Zoom stuff, which I think Stefano has full permissions to do that. So
yeah, that's correct.
I think the first thing to do is to just make clear who is leading the work. And since, or if you could scroll down, the person.
So this is Tom. This was Tom's write-up, right?
Thank you, Tom. Yeah. So it sounds like Tom wants to volunteer to lead some of this work. Who's our point of contact?
I don't know if I can. So I can definitely volunteer to figure out who should do that work from Google side. I'm not sure I can commit to doing it myself, but despite having brought it up here, but let me get back to you on that.
Okay. Yeah, I think the most important thing is just to know who is the main point of contact from the TAC perspective, who's the point of contact for the working group to go set up the calendar items and hold the Zoom meeting and capture minutes. lead us.
Yep.
I can do that work for now if we don't have anyone else who wants to step up and say, raise their hand.
Interim.
That sounds like a fine plan.
Okay.
Ava, and I'll help you if between Tom and I will help you, but
Perfect.
I should be your counterpart for Google for now, from Google for now.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to move on, given that I want to close the meeting in about 20 minutes or so. And so I think we have some next steps there, which Stefano, you have the current action item there. And then Ava, you can figure out the meeting or whatever as soon as there's a Zoom link, if there's the next meeting, or how you want to kick it off between Dimitri and you and anybody else that wants to participate. So.
Will do.
Okay, so I'm going to move off of this one. Feel free to comment for a minute or so while I switch back to, I think next up is the, I would like to defer the webinar question follow-up. Oh, actually, we can do one of two things. We can either cover the webinar question follow-up, or we can start on the RATS architecture overview. Do people have a preference between those two topics? Because we can only do one of them.
RATS sounds more interesting to me.
I'm biased, but I think so too. But all right, I'm going to do the RATS one then. And so I don't know, I'm going to stop in 20 minutes. So we'll see how far we get, because I mostly have diagrams here, and I'll just voice over all the interesting information here. So the IETF RATS attestation architecture overview. And at least 3 of us here on the call have been heavily involved in this, between myself, Eric Voigt, and Thomas Fossati, and others who are not on the call. But there's at least 3 of us that have been in like weekly meetings, for a long time now. So let's start off. I'm just going to go to slightly larger here, full screen. All right. So the RATS working group is a backronym which doesn't quite fit the acronym. And so it's a remote attestation procedures. So it's not quite an acronym, but that's where it came from. Go scratch your head. So the RATS working group in the IETF is chartered to do architecture, chartered to standardize data formats, but it is not chartered to standardize protocols or to do code. So just to draw a line there. And so I'll be talking about architecture and data formats. I will only be talking about protocols or code by reference, but there's nothing that would be standardized from the IETF RATS working group on protocols or code, and I'll explain the protocols point later when we get to that. I mentioned those are the 3 of us on this call here who've been very involved in this architecture discussion and are actively involved in RATS. For anybody who's new, the RATS architecture document and our own TAC white paper both reference each other now. And that's the URL for which you can find all of the RATS documents. Although the last time that I clicked on that one yesterday, it had a bug where it was only referencing older versions of documents, not the latest one in the repository. So just be aware of that. If you click through to a doc, it may not be the latest version. You got to make sure you get to the right version of it. So. So the latest version of the RATS architecture, I think, is numbered 10. And when I looked, it only linked to 8 for some reason. So it needed a refresh or something. So, all right. So let me walk through some of this stuff you already know, but I'm just going to explain as to baseline, basically what's in the RATS architecture right now. So you have some communication between 2 parties that you think needs attestation. And so there's a statement that I've often made that has never been disproven, so I'm going to assume that it's true. If you like, you can call it a failure conjecture, but that every authentication use case is an attestation use case. So every protocol that does authentication right now is a candidate for adding attestation to, right? Feel free to disprove on your own, but right now I'm going to treat this as being this communication between 2 parties called a tester and underlying party. And in order to add attestation, you have something that is a verifier. Now, there may be cases where the verifier is bundled into their underlying party. It could be separate, but I'm going to describe everything here like the RATS architecture does, as if everything was a conceptually separate entity, whether it's running on a separate machine or the same machine or whatever. You can combine roles, right? But each of these is being treated as logically separate. So evidence is the thing that comes out of an attester. The relying party never sees evidence, it sees attestation results. So it's the job of the verifier to decide whether the evidence is considered trusted and to put information into the attestation results that relying parties can actually use. Okay. How does the verifier and relying party?
Question.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
You talk about a communication needing attestation. Is it not more generally, or could it not more generally be an action or set of actions?
Yes.
One of which might be communication, but communication is a very specific case. And I can think of many where it's not that.
You are right. And this line, the black line here, does not actually appear in the diagram of the document. Everything else does. And so, yes, you are right. This is my attempt at making it be understandable or setting some context, but you're right. That could just say, action and not communication. And so,
and
the line could be sneaker net. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Okay. So the verifier and the lying party need a way of deciding whether evidence or attestation results are good and trusted. And so that's where the notion of appraisal policy comes in. So the verifier owner configures the verifier with some appraisal policy for evidence, and similarly for the relying party. Examples of appraisal policy at a minimum might be, so which signing keys or certificates are the ones that you consider trusted, right? So a relying party might be configured with saying, here's the verifier keys that I consider trusted, only accept for attestation results that are signed by those keys, right?
Sorry, I'm going to ask another question.
Go ahead.
So on the right-hand appraisal policy, is that really a policy or a notification of the evidence required?
It can be arbitrarily complex. So the things that are in the blue are considered to be core in scope for rats. The things that are considered in kind of brownish orange are things that are considered to be necessarily present, but technically outside the scope of what rats is doing. And so it's there in the architecture to help you understand what rats is doing.
I'm just not sure what an appraisal policy means for attestation results.
Okay. So it means that when attestation results come in, you get some message, and I don't mean that in a communication sense. It could be a file if it's offline or whatever. You get some blob of stuff. And how do you decide whether to grant the action based on that? You have to make some decision. Whatever your criteria is for making that decision as to whether that action should be granted or not, based on the contents of those attestation results, is your appraisal policy.
Got it. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
And the same thing in the appraisal policy for evidence, whether you consider that evidence good or bad, is it could be a piece of code. It could be a simple set of, here's a certificate that's necessary. In general, it's somewhere in between, in the middle of that spectrum. Okay, just directives that tell you how to appraise that evidence and make a decision that is typically a binary decision. It doesn't have to be a binary decision. Okay, it could be you get some degraded version of that action or something, in theory, but normally it's binary. But this appraisal policy often needs specific things, like let's look at the appraisal policy for evidence, right? So the evidence is going to contain a bunch of information that's in it, and the appraisal policy is going to have to do things like, okay, if the evidence contains something that says, I'm running on, let's say, SGX version such and such based on processor capability, or AMD SEV with the following thing turned on or not in debug mode, and so on. So you're referencing some specific values you might be comparing for equality or containing in a set. And that's where this notion of reference values comes in. Those could be embedded in the appraisal policy themselves, or they could be incorporated by reference. So they might say, okay, it's good if the values are the values that come from this signed set of reference values from this external reference value provider. So as an example, if I'm the owner of a particular machine, I might say, and it needs to have the latest reference values from Intel or AMD, for example, right? So that might be a separate reference value provider if it is not embedded in the appraisal policy itself. Okay. Another example is where you might have to say, okay, well, how do I know? So let's say it's an Intel processor. How do I know that it's a valid Intel processor and not something spoofing that, right? So that's where a notion of endorsement, which is some external entity, often the manufacturer, endorsing that the attester's signing capability and signing key is valid. So, Intel Inside type of thing. That's an endorsement where an external entity vouches for the root of trust in the attester itself. Okay, so all these things play together and are kind of inputs the appraisal policy can then reference. Okay, but these are the terms that's used. This is a definition of terms and kind of the conceptual data flow. Now, this does not show what the protocols are. This says data flows from the attester to the verifier, whether it flows through some other entity, or the endorsements come, cached in the attester and come up. That's a protocol mapping. This is the conceptual data flow. Okay. I'm going to now drill down into the next diagram, which is blowing up inside the attester. There are two categories of environment. There are things that are attesting environments and there are target environments. Okay. And so the distinction is that the thing that appears in evidence is called claims. So it's, things like, type value pairs or something, type length value triples or whatever. And so they might be things that are measured is a typical term. At least that's the TCG term, that you measure stuff in a target environment. And it's the attesting environment that then collects those and signs the information. So you're not signing information about yourself. Here, the attesting environment is signing and vouching for things about a target environment. So this is just defining the terms target and attesting environments. And what goes in the evidence carries a signature from the attesting environment. So in one example, the attesting environment might be a TPM plus the ROM that's sending the values into the TPM. Okay, and the target environment might be, the measured kernel in the middle of your brute sequence, that type of thing. So just definitions of terms here. Those are types of environments, but in general, you can have multiple of these layers here. Oh, by the way, and so if you have an endorser, then the endorser might say, I attest or I endorse A, and so basically A signs B, and the endorser signs A. And so like in a chain of trust, you can think of it as if it was a certificate chain. It doesn't have to be certificates, but it's analogy. In some cases, it is a certificate chain where the leaf is B and the root is the endorser. Right. Okay. Now, same thing, reference values. If the appraisal policy includes reference values, you might need reference values that apply to both B and A, right? Because the evidence will include, between the evidence and the endorsement, you have values for A and B, and you have to be able to appraise that whole chain of stuff that says, for example, does it chain up to an endorser that I trust, and are the values of the claims in there ones that are provided from a reference value provider that I trust, as an example. Okay, so back down to inside the attester. There's these two categories of environments, but in general, there can be multiple layers of them. Okay, so these can be chained. So just like before, we had a chain that went from, this one at the leaf. Here, your leaf would be C, then up to B, then up to A, and then up to the endorser. Okay, and so here, each layer can measure or attest the layer above it. And so this might be ROM, a bootloader, an OS, or it could be ROM, an OS, an app, or workloads. There can be any number of these. There could be the simple one, the previous one. There could be any number of layers in between. So this is in the TCG. This is the dice mechanism, which is an arbitrary number of chains. And so if you hear the term dice, that's the 10,000 foot level view glossing over details. It's just saying you can have multiple layers here. Okay. And so what comes out at the top is evidence contains a set of layers that contains, in this case, A, B, and C. And so that's why reference values in the appraisal may need to reference A, B, and C. But the cert chain, if it's a cert chain, goes C, B, A, endorser. Okay, everybody with me? Okay, again, I'm just reporting out what's in the RATS architecture right now. The RATS architecture document is approaching last call, which means that it is fairly stable. There will be a discussion at IETF, which is in what, 3 weeks, something like that, to see if we're ready for last call. And so if there is feedback, this is still a good time for that feedback, but another couple months from now will be too late. So,
could you say a little more about the relationship between DICE and RATS?
DICE comes from the Trusted Computing Group. The Trusted Computing Group is one of the participating organizations in the RATS discussion. And so it may mention DICE by way of example, but DICE is a TCG standard for doing layered attestation with X509 certs. And the RATS architecture is more general, that it doesn't require X509 certs. It could be things other than X509 certs, where DICE is specific X509 as your cert chain.
Thanks.
Okay, RATS also deals with things like, using, I don't know, JSON web tokens, or just using raw public keys or whatever, right? That's at the protocol or mapping layer. The architecture itself is generic and could be used with things beyond just what TCG does. All right. So this is an example of layers inside of an attester. Then there's cases we could have even more complex devices, say, let's say Cisco routers. I think this diagram may have come from Eric originally, if I remember right. But so you could have more complex devices which actually have multiple, CPUs and things inside the same chassis. And so example is the outer line composite device might be a chassis, and there's different, line cards or things. And so you might have one attesting environment target, one attester here, and a different tester inside each of those. And so if you have all these attesters, you need separate mechanisms to go up to a verifier. And this is just saying, no, you could actually have composite evidence, which encapsulates evidence from multiple attesters into a single composite evidence that gets sent out to a verifier. Okay. I'm sure Eric will correct me if I summarize that wrong, but
nope, that sounds good.
Okay. All right. So now let's talk about how, because so far we've only talked about conceptual data flows, not actually what physical entities or protocols things might flow through. So let's start by talking about the mapping to protocols. Okay. And again, I'm going to call time in about 5 minutes. And so if you want to interrupt, that's fine, because I'm probably not going to get to the last slide. So, all right. So there's two ways to map to protocols, or these two common ways. And so one model is called the passport model, and the other model is called the background check model, right? So these models come from analogies to the way human processes work. And so in the passport model, the analogy is, I'm a tester, right? I go off to some agency here, the verifier, apply for a passport, submit my application and send all the evidence like my photo and a birth certificate or whatever is necessary in the country that I'm in. And I get back a passport, and then I can supply that passport as I visit various relying parties. I go to the airport, or I go through an immigration desk or whatever, and I supply that passport, and they look at it and says, okay, this is signed by, an organization I trust. This passport looks valid. It doesn't look like it's been forged or whatever, and therefore I let you through your immigration desk. Okay, so that's the passport model. And so you might have, so this is a case where the verifier is chosen by the attester, and the relying party might have a bunch of one or more verifiers that it accepts. Like in the immigration case, you might have a whole bunch of different passport issuing agencies that I accept from different countries, and I accept it through if it comes from any of the ones that I trust. Okay. The background check model of mapping to protocols is where the attester doesn't know anything about the verifier. It's the relying party that makes that choice. So the background check is more like I'm applying for a job application or a loan application, right? So I fill out the application from the relying party, the place that I'm applying for the loan or the job for, that's the evidence. So I submit all my information there, my driver's license, whatever it is. They then do a background check, and they go off to some agency that does background checks, and that's the verifier. So they submit all that stuff, and the verifier is the one that says, okay, all this stuff passes. I did the criminal record check and all these things in the back end based on this evidence. And so I give you, yes, this person is good, right? Background check passes. And so then the relying party says, great, okay, I'll grant you the loan or the job or whatever, okay? And so those are two popular models in human interaction. And of course, those same two models can work in actual protocols. So that's the definition of those two models, okay? Let's talk about the relationship among formats, right? And so there's those two lines. There's the evidence line, that's the conceptual data, okay? That's the evidence line here in red, and the attestation result here on the left, where the attester is just an opaque pass-through for attestation results, and on the right, where the relying party is an opaque pass-through for evidence. What is actually those evidence or attestation results? You see on the left here, the line between attester and the relying party passes an attestation result, where here it passes evidence. Now, if you go back to that line that Mike and I were talking about that I had labeled communication, right? And I said that was a situation where you already have some protocol that you're trying to add an attestation to. So that's partly why REST doesn't specify the protocol, because you want to be able to have these horizontal lines here as being any protocol that does authentication today, right? What REST might be interested in is the vertical lines here, right? Which may or may not already exist, and those are typically proprietary ones today. But the horizontal lines here, the point is you have to take existing protocols and let them carry attestation results, and existing protocols and carry evidence. And that's where this diagram that's sometimes referred to the bow tie as the bow tie diagram, because the shape comes in that says, because there's a bunch of different formats, because there's a bunch of different protocols, some of those protocols might be designed to carry X509 certs. Some of those protocols might be designed to carry JSON web tokens. Some of those protocols might be designed to carry CBOR web tokens. And so if you want to pass evidence or attestation results across that protocol between a tester and a line party, you better put it in that format or take whatever other format and encapsulate it in a format. So if you got an X509 cert and you need to pass it in a JSON web token, you encapsulate a X509 inside of a JSON web token. You can do that. For minimizing attack surface area, it's more efficient if you can encode it in the native thing. So if you have a protocol that carries X509, if your evidence is natively in X509, it's more efficient. And so TPM, that's things like TCG logs, for those of you that are familiar with that. So, and so that's where one of the jobs of the verifier, which has two jobs. Number one is to take whatever format the evidence is in, which the attester has, and potentially convert it into a different format that's the one that the relying party needs. So one might be conversion of format for the same claims, right? Because the same claims could be expressed in different formats here that and you might have claims over here, whether you get copied, derived, or whatever, is to do format translation. Second one is it has to be able to say whatever endorsed, because remember the chain on the left chains up to something that might be an endorser, or the chain on the right is not chaining up to necessarily the same key. It's chaining up to, say, the verifier, or whoever the verifier's key chains up to as the root. If it's, say, a PKI, it might be a public PKI root that the relying party chooses to trust. And so to translate one cert chain into a different cert chain with a different root is the job of the those are the two possible jobs of the verifier. To abstract how many different verifier formats, right? So you could have 4 different attesters with different formats, and a relying party needs them all in the same one. So it's also a way of pushing the conversions off to one in order to simplify the implementations in the relying party of the attester. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to kind of call time, and we can continue this next time, just to show you how far through this we are. I think there's 4 slides after this that are all text, not diagrams. And so we're actually most of the way through the complicated stuff, but I want to have time to have people ask questions. The last thing that I'll mention is what's in scope for RATS. RATS has EAT spec, which is a data format, which covers these top 2 lines. The IETF is specifying these top 2 here. TCG has specifications for some of the bottom ones. So with that, I need to call time because I need to drop off. So is there any other business before we end up closing the call here? Okay, now I will continue this discussion at the next TAC meeting, and we'll go through the rest of the slides.
Thanks, Dave. I hate to say it, I love this. This is fun. That's shows how sad I am, but thanks.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing, and I need to head out. So thank you all. If there's anybody that needs to stick around on the meeting, feel free. But the official TAC meeting part is now concluding, and we'll see you guys next time.
Cheers. Bye.